Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to dive straight into the incredibly complex chain of events that transformed the actions of one 19-year-old student into a 4-year global conflict, a conflict that cost over 20 million lives. Now, we've all heard this standard historical story, right? The famous assassination that started World War I, but today we are going to look at the massive, explosive foundation that was already set in place long before that fateful day in 1914.
It's a really fascinating thought experiment, isn't it? It's so tempting to think that, hey, if we just went back and stopped a single assassin's bullet, we could have saved the whole world. But as we're about to see, this single event was honestly just a matchstick thrown onto a massive, towering mountain of dynamite. If that specific matchstick hadn't been struck, well, the dynamite was still sitting right there, just waiting for another spark.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the spark of war, the assassination in 1914.
So let's look at the matchstick itself, the highly dramatic and honestly chaotic events of June 28, 1914. What absolutely blows my mind about this day is the sheer, unbelievable coincidence involved. Early in the morning, a bomb literally bounces off Prince Ferdinand's car and explodes in the street. Naturally, the prince is pretty shaken up, so he cancels his plans and decides to visit the injured folks in the hospital. But en route, his driver makes a literal wrong turn into a side street. And as they're awkwardly trying to back up and correct the mistake, the car happens to stop just 5 feet away from Gavrilo Princip. This kid was a 19-year-old revolutionary, part of a movement called Young Bosnia, and their ultimate goal was to free the South Slavs and create an independent Yugoslavia. So Princip sees this completely accidental, once-in-a-lifetime moment, and he fires.
Moving on to Section 2, a map of empires, Europe in 1914. Now, to understand why a localized assassination triggered a total global meltdown, we kind of have to pull back and look at the stark contrast in power across the continent at the time. In 1914, almost all of Europe was run by ruthless rulers with absolute power. They paid zero heed to the opinions of the masses. In fact, out of the entire continent, only 3 countries, France, Switzerland, and San Marino, were actually functioning democracies. The entire rest of Europe, it was essentially treated as personal property by monarchs who answered to absolutely no one.
And because these monarchs had totally unchecked power, they treated smaller nations like literal chess pieces. For 400 years, the region of Bosnia-Herzegovina had been under the Ottoman Empire. Then, in 1878, Austria-Hungary was given temporary administrative rights. But fast forward to 1908, and they just decided to fully annex and capture the territory. They essentially ripped it right off the map for themselves. This completely infuriated neighboring Serbia, who shared a deep ethnic connection with the Bosnians, and that land grab directly sparked the very revolutionary movements that Gavrilo Princip was a part of.
Right, so when the assassination happens, Austria-Hungary doesn't just arrest the perpetrators. They launch an attack on Serbia in retaliation. And this triggers an incredibly rapid, frankly terrifying domino effect, ironically called the chain of friendship. Because of all these secret backroom deals, Russia suddenly steps in to defend Serbia. Then Germany jumps in to protect Austria-Hungary. Next thing you know, France and Britain are dragged in alongside Russia. Within mere weeks, a local dispute over an annexation and an assassination dragged the world's greatest empires into total, unprecedented chaos.
Which brings us to Section 3, the mountain of dynamite, the 4 main causes. The absolutely crucial takeaway here is that these countries didn't just stumble blindly into war out of nowhere. No, they had purposefully been piling up explosive systemic conditions for decades. We can point to 4 foundational pillars that built this mountain of dynamite: nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and alliances. These were the deep-seated rot right beneath the surface. So let's break these down one by one to see exactly how they set the stage for destruction. First up, we have what was known as linguistic nationalism. Now, to be clear, this wasn't your standard nationalism associated with fighting for freedom or independence. This was a dark, aggressive nationalism based heavily on race and an extreme sense of superiority. Monarchs intentionally stoked these fires, convincing their citizens that they were inherently better than everyone else. They used this completely manufactured pride to justify really aggressive, hostile attitudes toward their neighbors.
And of course, that aggressive nationalism directly fueled our second pillar, imperialism. These empires were totally obsessed with invading and capturing other nations. Not to help them, obviously, but to brutally exploit their resources and cheap labor. They looted entire regions for power and gold. In fact, many critics describe this era of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, very much like what the East India Company did when it famously drained India's wealth for sheer profit.
And you can't violently take over the globe without a massive army, which brings us to our third pillar, militarism. Just look at these numbers. Between 1870 and 1914, the six great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Italy, they quadrupled their combined military spending. They went from 94 million to an astonishing 376 million pounds. They were arming themselves to the teeth to enforce their imperial goals. Combine all those weapons with those pre-existing alliances locking them together, and the dynamite was officially primed.
All right, our final theme, Section 4, Monarchs versus the Masses, a tragic contrast. All of this systemic buildup leads to one of the most tragic juxtapositions in human history. It is truly staggering to realize that at the very top, the rulers of Germany, Russia, and Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Tsar Nicholas II, and King George V, they were literal first cousins. This entire global conflict was, on some level, a brutal family feud among the ultra-elite. Meanwhile, down at the very bottom, the people actually bleeding and dying in the toxic trenches, they weren't fighting for some grand, noble ideal. They were mostly poor, unemployed commoners who only enlisted because they were desperate to earn a wage and feed their families.
But that raises a big question, right? How exactly do you get millions of poor, starving commoners to march straight into machine gun fire for a family feud between a bunch of wealthy cousins? Well, because the common man had literally no actual reason to fight, the empires relied heavily on aggressive newspaper propaganda. They painted military service not as the tragic meat grinder it was, but as a glorious, selfless duty to your nation.
The media and even official state poets completely romanticized the slaughter. Take Alfred Tennyson's super famous poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. It glorified the deaths of 200 British soldiers in a previous conflict, framing what was actually a horrific failure of military leadership as this beautiful, valiant act of heroism. Poets like Tennyson and Rupert Brooke wrote such compelling, glorious verses about dying for the empire that leaders, including Winston Churchill, actually used their poems as active recruitment tools.
But, not everyone bought into the propaganda. Intellectuals and writers like Rudyard Kipling, Wilfred Owen, and Thomas Hardy pierced right through the lies. Hardy's poem, The Man He Killed, perfectly captures the bitter reality of the whole thing. It's about two unemployed men forced in the uniforms who would probably just be grabbing a pint together if they met at an old inn, but instead they're forced to shoot each other dead, simply for the greed of empires. They were ordinary men forced to cough up blood for a cause that was never theirs.
And if you want the ultimate proof that the common soldiers had absolutely no personal hatred for one another, look no further than the famous Christmas truce of 1914. Right in the middle of this unimaginable carnage, British and German soldiers laid down their weapons, stepped out of their trenches, and just celebrated together. They sang songs, they exchanged food, they acted like human beings. And they only went back to fighting because their commanders explicitly threatened them with execution if they didn't resume the slaughter.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought to chew on. We've seen how decades of unchecked imperialism, out-of-control military spending, and extremely aggressive nationalism built a mountain of dynamite that just needed one little matchstick to ignite. Knowing that 20 million people died not because of a single bullet fired by a teenager, but because of systemic greed and unchecked power, how does that change the way you view global conflicts today? Are we looking closely enough at the dynamite piling up in our own time? Keep that in the back of your mind the next time you scroll through the news. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning what you see.